Open your Bibles this morning to John chapter 6. John chapter 6. Over the past several weeks, we've been in a series called Signs. Signs. We're looking at the miracles in the Gospel of John, which John calls signs because they point to who Jesus is. They are significant in that way. They sign something. They symbolize or represent who Jesus is in a way that maybe we wouldn't understand otherwise, who Jesus really is. And this morning we come to the fifth sign that John records. In a very famous passage in John chapter 6, we find the disciples traveling across the Sea of Galilee by boat. And during their voyage, they become caught in one of the very violent squalls that often comes upon that body of water. And the disciples, as I understand it, invented the first stationary rowing machine by rowing directly into the headwind and not moving. So this is just an exercise machine for them. That's the first stationary rowing machine. They just row, row, row all night, and there is no forward movement or not much to speak of. Because the water at the Sea of Galilee is well below sea level and surrounded by hills, cool air will come down from the hills and intermix or displace the warm, moist air over the lake, and violent wind gusts are common. So it's the middle of the night. The disciples have been with Jesus all throughout this day, and they've just witnessed Jesus feed the 5,000, and that's the story that we read last week at the beginning of John chapter 6, was the feeding of the 5,000, or 2 weeks ago, rather. And then we also read the last part of chapter 6 where Jesus explains the feeding miracle. But here in between, we have the night where Jesus comes to them in the wee hours of the morning, walking on the surface of the water in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, 3 miles from one shore, probably 2 or so miles from the other shore. 3 of the gospel writers have recorded this particular story: Matthew, Mark, and John. It's not in Luke, as it happens, but they each tell it in their own way. Matthew and Mark tell it in a slightly different way. They give a few more details than John. John's account is actually the shortest and the most to the point. But all 3 agree that the miracle took place immediately after the feeding of the 5,000, when all the crowds are there and Jesus feeds them. And then we're told that Jesus disperses the crowds and tells the disciples to get into a boat. John doesn't give us that particular detail, but Jesus goes up on a mountain and the disciples get into a boat to cross the lake. And that's basically what happens in all 3 accounts. But now let's read the way that John remembers this in John chapter 6. Beginning in verse 16, when evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I. Don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. It would have been incredibly dark on the Sea of Galilee at night. Can you imagine, without modern city lights dotting the shore? Probably just something like oil lamps dotting the shore. It would give them an indication of maybe how far they were from shore. These were fishermen. They knew the lake pretty well. They would fish at night often. It would have been really spooky if the moon was out, though. Can you imagine how eerie it would be to see a figure coming across the water toward your boat on a moonlit night? Moon reflecting off the water, and here comes this person. I mean, what would you think? Matthew and Mark tell us the disciples thought it was a ghost at first. How do you make sense of this? There's something walking out towards us. They couldn't make sense of it. And it was probably difficult to see clearly, you know. There were probably they were some distance, so they wouldn't have seen, let's see, if they were rowing west across the Sea of Galilee, they would have been rowing with their backs to the wind. So they would be looking out this way, and this is the direction that Jesus comes from behind towards the stern of the boat. Now, we don't know that they were afraid of the windstorm. Probably not. There were some seasoned fishermen in this boat. That doesn't say they're afraid of the wind. They've just been rowing. All we know is that they are exhausted. They've been rowing for hours and hours, and Mark tells us they were straining at the oars. It had been evening when they got into the boat after the feeding of the 5,000, late afternoon, evening. And Mark tells us that Jesus came during the fourth watch of the night between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. So they might have been rowing for 9 hours with their backs to the wind. That's a long time to row your boat. And then here comes Jesus approaching the stern of the boat from the east. Now, it wasn't raining, it's just a windstorm. Jesus knows you don't want to go walking on water when it's lightning out. That's dangerous. Water and lightning don't mix, kids. But the way John tells the story, it's very short. You see, there's not a lot of detail. He doesn't tell us about Peter getting out of the boat like Matthew does. He doesn't mention anything about the disciples thinking it's a ghost or about why the disciples got in the boat in the first place, the way that Matthew and Mark do. They tell us that Jesus compelled the disciples to get into the boat and go ahead of him while he dismissed the crowd. But there is a small detail that John gives us before the story that really changes the way that we understand this particular miracle. Whereas Matthew and Mark give us more of the logistics about why they got into the boat, what time it was when Jesus came out to them, what Jesus was doing while they were rowing, John is not interested in telling us any of that, because John is more interested in what this story represents. John tells us before, at the beginning of this chapter, something that sets the context for both the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on water. And we read it last week. John tells us that it was almost Passover. And if you go back to the book of Exodus and you read about Moses leading the children of Israel out of Egypt, closely linked to the Passover event are two major miraculous events. The manna that is miraculously provided in the wilderness, and the other is really the defining moment of the Exodus, when the people cross through the Red Sea on foot. With a wall of water on their right and a wall of water on their left, the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind so that they cross on dry ground. This is the event that again and again is remembered and retold throughout the Old Testament, that the Lord delivered his people at the crossing of the Red Sea. And more than any other gospel writer, John wants us to see this miracle and the feeding of the 5,000, both miracles, as inexorably linked with the Old Testament story of the Exodus. It's no coincidence that John chapter 6 is chock full of references to the book of Exodus, to Moses, to the manna in the wilderness, Jesus as the bread from heaven. And what's really peculiar about the placement of this miracle is that it seems to really interrupt the flow of the chapter. That's kind of why we skipped over this section last week, because it's right in the middle, sandwiched between the feeding miracle and Jesus' explanation of the feeding miracle, where he talks about him being the bread of life. Those two things would naturally go together, and yet we break in the middle with the walking on water. John does this because he wants us to interpret them side by side in light of the timing of both events near Passover. There are two details in the story that remind us especially of the Exodus. The first is the way that Jesus responds to the disciples when they see him. Jesus calls out to them and says, "It is I. Don't be afraid." But in Greek, the phrase is literally just, I am. Ego eimi. I am. And it could be translated as, it is I. The translators probably should do that. It doesn't make sense in good English to just say, I am. I am here, maybe. Something like that you could provide. But in the context, the thing about the phrase is that you would expect a name or something to follow after. It is I, Collin. It's me, Jesus. But here, it's just, I am. Don't be afraid. And what we have is an unmistakable reference back to the book of Exodus. where one of the big moments of the story is the burning bush and God revealing his name to Moses out of the burning bush, where Moses meets God face to face for the first time in Exodus chapter 3. And Moses says, when I go to Pharaoh, the people are going to ask, who sent you? What is your God's name? And God says, tell them, I am has sent you. The name of God in Hebrew has its origin in that story, Exodus 3. I am. It's not really a name. It's a way of saying that God is the one who is, who has no beginning, who has no cause, no end. He is eternal. He is who he is. And he can't be identified with just a Hebrew name. The really cool thing about the name I am is that it can be translated into any language just the way that it is, because every language has a verb of being. And so whether in Hebrew or English or Greek, we can hear and understand that this is the name of God who is and always will be, I am. The other thing that's so profound about the name of God is that it can only truly be spoken by God himself. Speaking the name can be a way of claiming the identity, because only God can truly say, I am. Nobody else can say, I am. Only God can truly claim that name, I am. Jesus didn't just show up on the scene of ancient Judaism and say, hey guys, I'm God. You ever wonder why didn't Jesus just come out and say, hey guys, I'm God? Because that could have meant anything to anybody. Just like in our world today, if someone says, I believe in God, you can read into the idea of God anything you want to, because people have weird ideas of God. And so do we sometimes. No, instead, Jesus says things like, before Abraham was, I am. Jesus speaks the divine name in a way that indicates, hey, everybody, there's more than one person who can speak this name truly. And that's what's so profound, that the name has a built-in feature that allows two persons, God the Father and God the Son, to share the identity of the name, because they can both speak, I am. The name actually makes room for the idea of the Trinity. Isn't that cool? And when Jesus walks on the water, John wants us to see that this is like the burning bush, except in the place of the I am is Jesus. But not only that, there's another detail that reminds us of the Exodus. Did you notice at the end of the story, John says something about them taking Jesus into the boat? Taking Jesus into the boat, and immediately it says they reached the shore where they were heading. That's a strange detail, isn't it? Only John mentions this particular detail. In fact, you might hardly even notice that John is actually telling us about another miracle here. This is not just about Jesus miraculously walking on water. There's another miracle here, that apparently, even though they were at least a couple of miles from the shore, when they see Jesus, remember John specifically told us they rode about 3 miles, maybe close, between 3 and 4 miles. And the distance would have been 5 miles or so. So they have another 1.5 to 2 miles to go. And yet when Jesus gets to the boat, they arrive immediately, John says, finding that they have traversed the 1.5, 2 miles seemingly in an instant. How? There's no mention of them rowing. It's not like they were just so amazed that rowing the other 2 miles seemed like nothing. No, John is saying we were just there. I don't know how else to say it. We were just at the place. Jesus got in the boat, and there we were. And it's a little confusing, actually, because it says when they realized it was Jesus, they were willing to take him into the boat. What does that mean? I think it means that they were just willing to row Jesus the rest of the way. It's a fair question. Is he going to walk the rest of the way by himself and just go right by us? Or should we give him a ride? Should we row Jesus the rest of the way, or should he just walk and pull us the rest of the way? Who's going to give who a ride in the middle of the lake? Okay, so they were willing, or they wanted to take Jesus into the boat with them and row him the rest of the way to the shore. But once he's in the boat, they were just there at the shore immediately. So why does John end the scene like that? That's sort of the punchline of the story that John leaves us with. For John, there's something about the crossing to the other side that is important. There's something about making it, crossing to the other shore, that is important. He wants us to know that Jesus brought them across the sea miraculously. Matthew and Mark focus on different things. The way that they end the story of Jesus walking on water, they're actually still in the middle of the lake when the story ends. The story ends in both cases with how the disciples respond in utter amazement and worship in Matthew, and in Mark, the story ends with the disciples still not really understanding the full picture. And then that's sort of the end of the episode, and they're still in the middle of the lake, but the focus is on how the disciples are interpreting this event. But in John, his focus is not about what the disciples do or don't understand at this point. He says nothing about that. John is looking back and thinking through what this story represents. And what John really wants us to see is that Jesus walked the waves in order to bring them across the sea, just like the Exodus. This is the burning bush and the Red Sea combined. For John, the point is not just that Jesus has the divine power to walk on water, to defy the principles of gravity or density of water and tread upon the waves. That's incredible. It is. That's an indication that this is someone who has complete control over the natural world. But John wants to be even more specific than that. John wants to say that this is not just a divine power. What John wants to say is that this is the same divine person who brought Israel across the sea in the Exodus. This is the same divine person. This is the I am, the God of Israel, treading the waves to bring his people across the sea. Could it be that rolling around in John's mind was Psalm 77? We read it a little bit earlier in the service. Psalm 77 is a poetic way of retelling or reimagining, remembering Exodus and the Red Sea. Psalm 77 says this in verse 13, "What God is as great as our God? You are the God who performs miracles. You display your power among the peoples. With your mighty arm, you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. The waters saw you, God. The waters saw you and writhed. The very depths were convulsed. Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters. Though your footprints were not seen, you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron." John, steeped in these Old Testament scriptures, these stories of remembering and retelling the Exodus, sees in this event that this is the same person, the same God who spoke in the burning bush, the same God who divided the Red Sea. He's right there, treading the waves. Or could John also be thinking of Isaiah 43, where God speaks of himself as the one who made a way through the sea, a path through the mighty waters? That's Isaiah 43:16. Isaiah 43:2, the choir sung earlier, "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you." Or Isaiah 51:10, "Who made a road in the depths of the sea so that the redeemed might cross over?" The same one who made a road in the depths of the Red Sea walked on the waves of the Sea of Galilee. The same God who spoke in the burning bush, who provided bread in the wilderness, who made a way to cross the Red Sea, was here now providing bread near Bethsaida and bringing his disciples across the waters. The one who said, "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you," had come to be with his people. And yet, the wind still raged, didn't it? And the disciples still struggled at the oars for 9 hours before Jesus finally came to them. Have you ever considered that? That Jesus could have stopped the windstorm. Jesus could have just let the disciples row across, silence the wind. He could have stopped the wind, but he chose not to. Jesus could have come earlier to bring them across, but he chose not to. It's the same God, then and now. But why did Jesus allow them to endure the wind for so long? In fact, there were probably moments during that time when the disciples wondered, where is Jesus? They would have assumed that he wasn't coming because they were in the middle of the lake. After all, how could he come to them in the middle of the water? The experience of feeling that God is far off is not just the disciples' experience. That's actually the psalmist's experience in Psalm 77, the feeling that God is far off. The feeling that God is far off from you, especially in a time of great struggle or darkness, that's one of the tests, the great tests of the Christian life. It's not unusual for a Christian to come to a particularly dark place in life and to ask the question, why does it seem that God is so far from me at the very point where I need him the most? In fact, the disciples were in the boat because Jesus had told them to go to the other side. So they were in the process of obeying Jesus. And it's a very shallow theology, a shallow theology indeed, that says that if we're in the will of God, that we will always sail smoothly through life, that we'll have no sickness, no sorrow, no disappointment or depression, that obedience will always lead to health and wealth. And there's a Greek word for that. It's baloney. Pronounce it later. I'll show you how to write it. Baloney. I don't know that being in the center of God's will for the disciples, at least here, it wouldn't have felt like the safest place to be. And yet they're doing what Jesus told them to do. They're crossing the lake. Jesus told us to do this. I guess we'll just strain at the oars. We'll just stick with it. Doesn't feel like the safest place to be right now. Perhaps it's not the safest place to be. Maybe it's the best place to be, not always the safest. We're going to have difficulty, and sometimes that difficulty will come in the process of obedience, in the path of obedience. But when the wind was against the disciples, did you know Jesus knew? Mark says Jesus saw. Jesus knew. He knew they were straining at the oars. In John, it's just implied that Jesus knew precisely where they were because he comes to find them. He knew what they were enduring. That's why he comes out there. And there will be times in the Christian experience when the storm continues much longer than we thought God should allow it. Couldn't Jesus have come earlier in the night? Why the long night of rowing? What does that accomplish? Why would God allow that? When it goes through the night and doesn't cease, and during those times, know that even when Jesus is beyond the range of your sight, you're never beyond the range of Jesus' sight. He sees you. He knows. He knows what you're enduring. He sees. And when you pass through the waters, he is with you. And our calling is to keep steady at the oars, even when it's all you can do to simply hold your position. Sometimes people say, if you're not going forward, then you're going backwards, but that's what we call fair weather wisdom. Because when the wind and the waves are against you, you do well if you simply hold your position. Now, to be fair, it's not as though John wanted this whole story to be a metaphor for the storms of life. That's not the purpose of the story. We see that. But John, I believe, does want us to hear Jesus' words to the disciples just as if they could be his words to us. Jesus doesn't provide an explanation for the delay when he arrives walking on the water, just like he doesn't provide an explanation to us for the things that he allows us to endure. All he says is, I am. Don't be afraid. I'm here. Don't be afraid. Sometimes when a child is very badly hurt, you don't want to shush them or even try to stop their crying because they're hurt bad enough to cry. You know that. You let them cry. Crying is a natural response to pain. There's a point where all you can do is hold them and tell them, I'm here. I'm here. and just let them cry. Because what you want your child to remember is not that you, as a parent, always kept them from pain. You want them to remember that when they were hurt, they were not alone in the pain. And what Jesus says is so simple. I am. It's me. I'm here. Jesus' presence was the presence of the I am, the one who is. He was greater than the wind. He was greater than the water. His power was holding them all. Even though we know he doesn't always keep us from pain or struggle, we know that the one who is with us. And that's the one whose providence governs all things. Just like the disciples, there's not a storm that we face that doesn't have the providence of God all over it. God's providence, which he allows for a time and purpose, God's providence meant them to row against the wind for hours and hours and hours. They rowed against the wind by God's providence, and he allowed it for a time and for a purpose. And so he says, don't be afraid. I'm here. Don't be afraid. You don't have to be afraid, not because I won't let anything bad happen to you. That's not Jesus' promise. Jesus doesn't say, don't be afraid, I won't let anything bad happen to you. No, Jesus says, don't be afraid when bad things happen. But Jesus, how can you even say, don't be afraid? How can you say that? How can you command someone not to be afraid? Seems impossible, doesn't it? Ever had somebody tell you, don't be afraid? And you said, thank you very much. I'm afraid right now. So you telling me not to be afraid doesn't really help me not be afraid. I fear, okay? I don't have total control over my fear response. So it seems completely impractical. How do you obey this command? I mean, I can obey commands about lying or stealing or showing mercy because I can choose those things. I can choose to obey commands where I have control of my response, maybe. But fear is not something that I'm choosing. It's a response that I'm not in control of all the time. I don't know anyone who says, well, it looks like something very bad is going to happen to me, so I'm just going to choose to be afraid right now. I will choose fear. Feels good. No. When you're afraid, there's no magic switch that you can just flip off and be like, I'm not afraid now. Fear is optional. Jesus doesn't just say, don't be afraid, though, does he? He says, I am. It's me. I'm here. Now, don't be afraid. The command not to fear is based on the knowledge and the presence of someone that you can choose to trust or not to trust. I was up in the mountains last week with my kiddos and was trying to teach my two younger kids to ski, a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old. It's a lot of work. It's very tiring. But when it comes to skiing, did you know this? Fear is a thing. When you're up on the mountain, you're trying to ski, fear is a thing. And with the younger kids, they don't quite have enough life experience to be really afraid. You know, so the fearless kids are just flying down the mountain. They are. And when they fall, they only fall about 6 inches, so, you know, it's not so bad. And my job is kind of to not take them anywhere on the mountain where they can really hurt themselves. So we stayed on the really easy runs. But I've got 2 older kids too, and they've been skiing before, and they don't want to just stay on the easy runs. They want to go to the top of the mountain where it's steeper. You ski for longer. So I took the 2 oldest kids up. And right on the brink of some pretty steep trails, one of them says, let's go back. Let's go back. There's only one way down the mountain. The conditions actually were a lot icier than I would have liked. And that makes it a lot harder to stop. And I think he was afraid because this felt different than anything he had skied before. Because it was a lot icier and you slide more, you just don't stop as well. So it's a little more scary, destabilizing on the steeper trails. And in that moment, there was something to fear. Absolutely. It was scary and steep and icy. But I said to my son, don't be afraid. And I was absolutely confident I wasn't afraid. Do you know why I wasn't afraid? Because I know how to ski. Because I've been on mountains before a lot in my life. And because I've been down trails, icy trails, exactly like that kind of condition before. And do you know, I was absolutely confident that he didn't need to be afraid? 3 reasons. Because I knew how to ski, been on mountains a lot in my life, been down the same kind of trails before, and I was with him. And when the option to trust is on the table, fear becomes optional. You can choose to fear, or you can choose to trust. If you don't trust, you'll fear. But when the option to trust is out there, fear is optional, even when there's something to be afraid of. And do you know why Jesus could say to his followers 2,000 years ago, and why he can whisper to us today, fear not? Because he's been through the water before. He led Israel across the Red Sea. He knows how to tread the waves. He controlled the wind that drove back the water on either side. This is the same I am who spoke from the burning bush. He knows the trail because he made the mountain. And not only that, he's been in the same boat. Any boat you're in, Jesus has been in the same boat. Betrayal, confusion, affliction. He knows weariness and pain. He understands betrayal, and he knows what it is to suffer in great darkness. He's been through it. He's been through death and come out on the other side resurrected. And what Jesus is putting on the table for you and for me is the option to trust instead of fear. Because when the I am says, I am here, fear is optional. Whatever it is that you fear may be real. I'm not saying it's not real. Fear of the unknown is scary. Fear of the future, fear of loss, fear of loneliness, fear of betrayal, fear of failure, fear of death. And Jesus says, I've been through death and I know the unknown and I hold the future and I've known betrayal, loneliness, and loss. And the only real failure is the failure to trust in me. Don't be afraid. Maybe you're afraid to follow where you know Jesus is leading you, because maybe he's leading you into some ministry or some area that makes you very uncomfortable. I don't know. Maybe he's asking you to trust him and move forward confidently with the step that he's leading you to take. I don't know. You don't have to be afraid, even when there's something to be afraid of. Jesus modeled that kind of incredible confidence in the Father when he went to the cross. Never forget that our Savior marched willingly to his own death, confidently, and he did not give in to fear. He was braver than hell, literally. Think about the thing that you fear most. Hold it in your mind. Now hear your Savior say, fear not. I'm here. Fear is optional because you have the option to trust in the I am, who says, I am here. And I've been there. I've been there, and I'm here. Fear not.